Hi, welcome to Stories and Spoilers, the podcast. My name's Alyssa. I'm your podcast host, and I am joined by an amazing author who is creative, outspoken, and has written one of my favorite books of the year. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. I'm George M. Johnson, New York Times bestselling author of All Boys Aren't Blue, as well as the author of my newest book, Flamboyants, the Queer Harlem Renaissance I Wish I Knew.
Thank you so much for coming. I am so excited to ask you all the questions, and everyone on the podcast already knows that Flamboyance is one of my favorite books of the year. So let's jump into the icebreakers. What is one of your favorite three books of the year?
Oh, that's a good question. What is one of my favorite three books of the year? And it's like we're at the end of the year now, so I'm just
Mhm.
like, what is one of my favorite three books? Because I also deal with the book bans and everything else going on. So it's like I don't have a whole lot of time to read as much as I should probably be reading.
Absolutely.
Uh, I don't, that's a hard question. I actually don't know if I've like fully read any new books. I reread old books. So, Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eye is the main book that I reread a lot.
Yes.
Um, and like who else had a new book this year? That I know that I've read. I don't know. I'm terrible. I'm a terrible interview.
No, no, classic books are amazing, and I know you reference them a lot in your books, so that totally makes sense. Why do you reread The Bluest Eye so often?
That was Toni Morrison. I always say, like, for Toni Morrison to do that on her first book, I just feel like I'm still working to get to that type of level of
Mhm.
craft. And I think every time I reread it, I feel like I learn something new about just her ability to write and like my own abilities to write. And I honestly do feel like with each book, I'm getting better. With the writing, because I actually have three books. I have a second book too. It's called We Are Not Broken,
Ooh.
which is about it's my grandmother's story about raising, being one of the primary caregivers for me, my younger brother, and my two cousins. That did really well and got a Carter G. Woodson honor, like for young adults as well. But yeah, I reread that book a lot because it kind of puts me back into like that space. I was like, that was her first book. All Boys Are Blue was my first book. And so there's just something there for me to remind myself to keep growing as a writer.
Mm.
So yeah, that's the one that kind of sharpens my tool.
Wow, what a creative and beautiful response. If that gives you listeners any sense of like the tone of this amazing author's writing, every page is magic. Every word will pull you in, and then by the time your books end, I just want more. Like for people who haven't seen it, Flamboyance is so smooth. The audiobook has jazz kind of like interchanged throughout each chapter. I loved the audiobook. I love the physical copy. The cover is absolutely gorgeous. All of your book covers are gorgeous. And your voice, you read Flamboyance on, I listen to it on Audible. I absolutely loved your voice and
Thank
the
you.
way that you share the stories. Like magnificent. The only word I can use is like the same feeling you get when you watch Impossible with Whitney Houston from Cinderella. That magical feeling where like there's gold in the air and everything is beautiful. That's how this book felt for me. And before I completely like nerd out about it, I have another question for you. What made you fall in love with writing? Because your writing really does feel romantic and so beautifully fleshed out. So what made you fall for writing in the first place?
I had a very high disdain for the books I had to read growing up. I was not a huge fan, and anyone who has ever seen me speak publicly, of Catcher in the Rye.
Mm,
I'm not a huge fan of The Invisible Man. I was not a huge fan of The Glass Menagerie. I was not a huge fan of just like a lot of those books that were on our summer reading lists. And I was always a good writer when it came to like doing reports, when it came to doing research. I was really, really good at that. And uh, my professor, Dr. J, I still talk to her, and she's like, I just remember when you came into that class and you did your master's thesis, but you memorized it. And so you did
wow.
it off the top of your head without slides, and you broke everything, and like you just went up there and did it. So I've always been good at like that, orating as well as like researching and report writing. Uh, But I think I always just had like this creative thing in me that I knew was there, like nagging. Um, and so even when I was a journalist, I used to have trouble with certain editors because of my writing style was just like not as investigative reportive, or you could tell I didn't go to J school, or like, just
Mm,
certain things that they would be like, oh, well, you wouldn't write it like that, or you wouldn't write it like this. But I knew that like at the heart of writing was like there had to be like, I don't know, I always say like writing still has to have soul and still needs to have spirit.
I couldn't agree more.
And I think a lot of people think writing come from too cerebral of a place when they're writing. And so
Hmm.
it's not even a conscious decision the way that I write. I just know that I'm writing from a space of like care and like my spirit and my soul. And so I guess maybe that's why, because you're not the first to say, like a lot of people say, like you write like enchanted. And they were like,
Yeah.
they're like, that doesn't really make sense. But they're like, it feels enchanting at times when you're
Hmm.
writing and like whimsical and like free. But they were like, but you're writing through some very heavy subjects
Yeah.
with a light style. Like they're like it's a very interesting way that you write, and yeah, and so I just feel like maybe because I try to tap in a little bit more into the spirit of things. Like I love like the way that James Baldwin writes, like the way
Absolutely.
that he writes, and I love again Toni Morrison and like the descriptive. I like for people to feel like they're there when I'm writing. Um,
Yes.
and so, yeah, that's where my love of writing came from, my disdain of books that I had to read.
You have to write the books you want to read. And I genuinely feel like Flamboyance was the first book that I've read in a very long time that was able to share the life stories of so many people within the LGBTQIA community. As someone of color who's also in the community, I feel like it's almost like a secret history. It's not shared a lot in schools. I've had the privilege of going to a really great college, and I'm still in college, and I just never got to hear about the history of people like Audre Lorde, people like James Baldwin. I didn't find that until unfortunately I got a higher education, which not everyone gets. And I was on
Yeah.
scholarship. Like that's a huge blessing.
Yeah.
Especially as a queer person out in, politics now in the world now, it's very hard to find love stories and sci-fi and horror that has us unless you use social media, which has been a huge gem. And I really wanted to use the podcast to highlight how beautiful your books are and to share with even more friends and more bookish souls out there how amazing your books are. And I will have them all linked in the show notes below. And I just feel like you're writing, the best word for it is magical, but it's magical amidst darkness. Like you can't see the sparkles and the beauty of it without having to recognize the harder topics that you do discuss, but they're necessary. History isn't always like they were activists and they never made mistakes and they never like that's not realistic, you know? And the way you write is not only educational, but it almost feels like a phone call with a friend or
Yeah.
like with an older sibling who's like, hey, like this is the tea. This is what actually happened. Um, and it made learning fun again. And for a huge nerd, like it made history feel like we were there in the Harlem Renaissance. Like you're at the party and you can smell the booze and the perfume and you can see the glory, but also like the sad parts. Very almost like Great Gatsby-esque, where there's like the sparkle, but there's also that other side where it's like this is really the reality of what it was like during that time, or this is the things this person did that weren't okay. And they probably
Absolutely.
knew it wasn't okay, and I'll wink to that later in the episode. There's a specific chapter you wrote in Flamboyance where I was like, oh, and I will, someone who's very romanticized. There were things about this person where I was like, I had no idea. And that's the beauty of your books is that you learn. Speaking of writing and kind of, guilty pleasure and all of that, what is a guilty pleasure genre you love? I love hearing about people talk about like, you know what? I'm a huge fan of like sci-fi monster romances, or I love historical fiction that's like super taboo and no one knows about. What's a book genre that you find yourself like, this is not for everybody, but this is for me?
Yeah, I would say it's very specific, but it would be black horror.
Ooh, I love black horror.
It's yeah, and I mean not just like not horror with black characters.
Mm. Okay, okay. Tell me
Those
more.
are two different things. And so I'm like, you can have horror that has black characters, but then you could
Mhm.
also have what I or many of us like to call, which is like black horror, which in a sense, it's not just about like the societal things that happen around us, but it's kind of like so the book Beloved is black horror, but a lot of people don't know that. They don't read it as that. And because they don't read it as that, sometimes they don't fully understand what the book was trying to say, which it
Mm.
like in certain ways, right? Because like if the decision is to kill your child or have your child go into slavery,
Mhm.
that's a black horror that only a black person could ever even have to make that decision to do. And
Absolutely.
so, but the horrific thing about it is that you didn't really have a decision. Like
Mhm.
you made a choice may have been made, but realistically, was there like a what kind of decision is that? That's not a real, like, you know what I mean? So it's like that's the horror of it is that when and I love reading books that kind of go into like that space of
Mm.
decision making that really has no there is no right answer. Like there's
Yeah.
literally no right answer because unless you can see into the future to know that slavery was going to end and that all of you were going to end up surviving it,
Mhm.
that's the only way to get to the regretting of the decision. But the other thing scenario could have happened too. And
Right.
so I love reading any book that kind of puts like the black experience into perspective of the horror of the black experience. And you can do that
Mm.
with it being as realistic as that, or you can do it like how Octavia Butler did. They did the show about it. What's the name of that
Was it
book?
about like they were
When she was going back in
like
time and she
fairies almost like where their bodies were
the
swapped?
one where no, this is the one where she was going back. She would wake up like back in slavery.
Was did it have Janelle Monáe in it or something like
No,
that?
no, no, no. That's a totally different
Different
movie.
one?
That's a
Similar.
but it's right, but a similar concept,
Yeah.
but it's really built off of what the book that Octavia Butler wrote that
Can't remember
had that
the
storyline.
title.
And like I said, it's slipping me because I'm just exhausted. It's been a long
It's
work day.
okay.
But
It's no worries. If anybody
but
knows,
yeah,
put it in the comments
those are
because I don't
like
know.
that type of those type of horrors, right? Or even like
Mm.
Sankofa, the movie, like the movie. I believe the movie was called Sankofa, where the girl one day woke up and was on a slave boat, right? Like that type of genre bending horror is like an experience that only we could experience, you know,
Yeah.
not like oh, a black killer. Like, even though I like that type of stuff too, but I like the very specific books of black horror when they really have to tap into the human condition of like, no, this is actually what a horror looks like for us. Even if we have spirit involved and supernatural involved and other things involved, because Beloved had that too, right? So that's the genre that I really really
Hmm.
love.
Okay. I think that's an interesting genre, especially with newer books coming out like The Black Girl Survives in this one, where it was a short story like anthology of black horror, even stories like Never Whistle at Night with indigenous horror and stories that were shared, which was episode I want to say one or two with the podcast. There are certain fears and there are certain feelings that those stories kind of incite and pull out of you, but as someone of color, you already feel like anxiety linked to certain things. So reading those books can be very visceral. And I think Beloved, I have only read it once. I think it's same thing with Roots. Like I've only watched it. I've only been able to do it once. I'm a big softie. But it it doesn't like the same fear you feel when maybe you read like a Lovecraftian story, and Lovecraft is a huge racist. I don't feel like I feel like fear is very inherent and it's linked to people individually. Like people's fears can differ, of course, but like the fear linked to our history and the fear linked to any that repeating again or God forbid, like going back in time and like what would a person I think that what you brought up, yeah, decision, like what choice could you make is a great debate and it's a great kind of mind, like something to kind of chew over and think about. And luckily your books kind of I feel like provide that, but in a way it's almost like food for the soul. Like where there is horror and it kind of makes you like, what would you do in the situation? Your books almost feel like comfort in that way to me. I receive it as like a comfort, like everything will be okay. So it balances out. Like your books are the light to me in reference to like that darkness that is inherent and is needed to be able to appreciate like the beauty of your books. If you ever dive into horror genre though, I would gladly read it. I would read anything you write. I'd read anything you write. My last icebreaker question for you is if you could go back in time, which is a horrible question now, but if you could go back in time and have dinner with an author, who would it be and why?
I go back in time and I don't know who to be and why.
Hmm.
I'm not sure if they ever became an author. They were a writer. I'm not sure if they ever became an author, but they probably did because they did just about everything. But I would love to have a conversation with Paulie Murray.
Oh.
I just think Paulie Murray's story is so interesting and like the whole identity crisis of it all, while also, you know, basically she was the reason, if I'm not mistaken, like that Brown versus the Board of Education. Part of her dissertation, part of her
Hmm.
dissertation in law school was like used by Thurgood Marshall, even though her and Thurgood Marshall, I believe, were in law school together. Like, like, and when she read her dissertation at Howard, they all were like, "That's like great dissertation, but like what you're saying can't happen." And then they ended up having to use her thoughts in that. She was the first to sit on the bus and boycott before Rosa Parks. She was excuse me, they were. And like Paulie just had done so many things. Paulie was like the first uh, non-man to be a cardinal, like a Catholic cardinal. It was so many things. The documentary was just amazing. I got to watch it like early on and talk about it. That'd be somebody who I would love to talk to just about like the navigation of that because I feel like there are times where like us as queer people we just doing things that we feel are right and we
Right.
don't understand the history that we're even setting or creating and history doesn't record it in that way either and so
Mhm.
I just thought their story was so interesting, and would love to just be able to sit with a mind like that.
Wow, I love that sentence to sit with a mind, like to be able to talk to someone so brilliant who maybe to them wasn't even like intentionally doing that. Like you said, they were just doing like, you know what? I want to go somewhere. I'm not moving for you. Being able to kind of have free thought, especially in higher education, like being able to be at such a prestigious college and share your feelings and share your thoughts and be beyond your time. How frustrating that must have been, but also how like that fire to pursue and to approach. That's interesting. I wanted to ask, what inspired you to write Flamboyance, the queer Harlem Renaissance I wish I'd known?
Yeah, my main inspiration behind Flamboyance was under the notion of like our heroes just being erased, or our
Mhm.
heroes being stolen from us, or our heroes just not being presented to us when we had a right to know who they were in their totality, especially as queer people, but even as just black kids. Even if you were a black heterosexual kid, you still should have known about the fact that there were other identities and people who were shifting culture that weren't heterosexual.
Mm.
This was my way of doing that work. I feel like growing up, I had to, like, I looked up to certain black people and black writers and across the board, but the thing that was missing was the identity piece.
Mm.
And it was like, I wish I had someone that I could connect to from that lens. That so that I knew that there were people like me who did exist in the past before me. Because when you don't see yourself reflected in the world, sometimes you can't even see your own reflection when you don't even understand what your place means in the world, especially as a kid and as a young adult. And so this was like my way of reintroducing them, excuse me, because and well, in some ways introducing some to the
Hmm.
world.
I
Uh,
learned
re-
some as well. You taught
yeah,
me through
and
the
I did.
book.
Yeah, I learned some,
Mm.
throughout the process of researching and reintroducing some into the world, but telling their story in a totality that oftentimes gets left out,
Mm.
while also not telling too much because I want people to be able to receive the work, understand the work, but not be bogged down by my words so much as wanting to go and learn more about these people
Mm.
in the same ways in which I get to do when I wrote the book.
Wow. I feel like in a lot of ways your book, even just the almost the poetic way you write and the poem at the end, just the way that you kind of wrap up the beautiful story. I wanted to know, was there a story that really resonated the most with you from this book?
I feel like that answer changes depending on what mood I'm in.
Okay.
I feel like I feel like I personally feel like Jimmy Daniel's story resonated a lot with me.
Mm,
Like a person who wasn't the first to do something. Because a lot of the people in the book were the first. Like they're
yes.
like first this, first that, first want to get a record deal, first want to have this, first. And if they weren't the first, they were the most known in
Mm.
their craft or their field. Like Langston Hughes as the great poet, and Zora Hurston, the author, the
Eyes watching God.
anthropologist. And
Yeah.
you're right. The so it's like most of these people in this book were like juggernauts in
Mm.
a in their space. But Jimmy Daniels was the one who wasn't. Like he did a lot of things and he opened a lot of doors. And I think it reminds me of like how to not forget about the people who we may never know, who
Mm.
also paved the road too, and who also opened doors for us too. It's like I may continue on my career and end up being huge, author, but don't that doesn't mean that we shouldn't know about someone who doesn't have as much, uh, many followers or in their face as me, because you never know. It could have been that person that was the one who gave me the opportunity to write.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? So that person made a choice too that paved the way, and their story deserves to be told too. And so I think that's what I really, really love about Jimmy Daniel's story is
Mm.
because it reminds us of like even people who you may never know are still doing things to open doorways and pave roads and pathways for you.
Wow. All your answers are amazing. And I feel like even just highlighting the importance of reading stories about Black LGBTQIA people who are living their lives to the fullest, who are photographers, artists, teachers. You don't have to be the first to be as important or as valid or as loved or as inspiring. You can be an amazing person and go down in history for affecting people's lives in a positive way or for inspiring people. Like, I don't think people realize, like, educators, like what you're doing educates people. And especially now, like, we need that, and it's digestible and it's inspiring, but it's also grounded in truth. Like, these are
Yeah.
real people's lives,
Yes.
and I loved what you said about losing heroes. Are we losing? You know what I mean? That. And your books like fight for that, but they also highlight like, hey, like these people are incredibly important and you, the reader, are important.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can't give you your flowers and I can't. Like, this is such like one of my favorite books of all time, hands down.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's so good. I did want to highlight a certain person. I did kind of wink to this earlier. Josephine Baker's chapter to me highlighted the highs and lows of her life. And I don't want to dive too into spoilers for readers. I want you guys to read this so bad. How did you find a way to write about a famous individual's life in such a unique way? You didn't shame her by any means, but you did highlight like, hey, you know what I mean? Like, there are certain things you said and there are certain things you did, girl. Like, what's up with that? And she was like, well, it was the past. You were like, So you did do that so beautifully. So how did you, write it in such a unique way? You didn't shy away from the lows by any means.
Yeah, I mean, I think because I am a memoirist first, I have a duty to care for people and to write people with love and care, even people who have harmed me, um, like harmed me
Mhm.
personally in a myriad of ways. I still have a duty to write about them in a totality, right? I'm my job is never to just make someone a villain. My job is
Right.
just to tell the story, and people will come away with it what they want to come away with it, especially because I'm writing about people who can't respond. And I think it would just be a disservice if I just went straight reading and carrying for filth for people
Listen.
who can't respond. So I just have a duty to write about them with care while still addressing
Hmm.
the 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 problems and addressing the issues that they may have lived with, that they may have created. And I also have to always remind myself that e- even when we're really good people, we're still, everybody is a villain in somebody else's story.
Mm,
Like,
true.
I'm sure there's several people who would be like, yeah, George definitely did this and is a villain in my origin story, or would be a villain in my origin story, right?
Wow.
So you have to remind yourself of that. And so I can only go but so far with judging or doing certain things because I'm a villain in somebody else's story too. And because I know that, I know how to write about it. Because I know how to write about when I'm the villain, and I did that in All Boys on Blue in several sections, like where I talk
Hmm.
about where I messed up and where I was wrong and where I may have harmed someone or did harm someone, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I think that was why I just wanted to make sure that I was writing about it with the care that it deserved, because it's a topic, that it just wasn't fully fleshed out or covered. And I mean, I kind of accidentally stumbled upon it. Like,
Mm,
it wasn't, because it's not like, if you just go read a regular biography, that's just not going to be, that part is not going to just really be there. And it really was
right.
just, I think, on like YouTube or somewhere
Wow.
where I found, I don't want to give too much away, but let's suffice to say,
Yes.
one of her kids, one of her adopted kids in 2020 is still was, I don't know if he's still alive today, but he was still alive and he addressed it, uh, and he forgave her.
Mm,
So, it just needed, the story just needed to be talked about in the totality of it, because she was a great like, she did a lot of great things,
mm,
but even all greats still have done things
absolutely.
to
The
harm.
artist and the art.
Yeah,
Where is the line? A lot of people are like, well, the artist did something horrible, so I can never look at the art again. I'm like, well, you know what I mean? The art may still inspire people versus the person may be people are flawed. Like people are flawed.
but
But the art itself is where's the separation between the art and the artist? Are they one or are they separate? And that's a big question I think about all the time. Like your favorite author wrote books that inspired maybe your books or inspired your view on film or etc. But if you find out something horrible about the author or the director, now you can never watch those films again. So everything you created from that inspiration, is that all moot now? So Joseph, and you do mention Beyonce in that chapter as well, and the parallels. And I was such a beautiful opener. You know what I mean? How you introduced the chapter. It was so like I felt like I was there. And
yeah,
Beyonce is such an iconic and such a large figure in Black culture and just in general and music. And Josephine Baker, I remember her from the iconic outfit, the banana skirt. That's the first image I can think of. And those eyes, and I think Lovecraft Country. I know she's referenced, I think, in it as well. And I'm just sitting here and I'm like, but to consider this person's flaws and to shine a light on that, I think is so brave because in a lot of memoirs, I feel like people more often than not don't want to address super dark stuff. They don't want to talk about it. And in the really good memoirs, they do. And I'm so glad you were like, nope, this is something we need to discuss. And without bashing this person, let's just be honest here. And it was refreshing. You know what I mean? Incredibly. So I'm so glad. I do want to shine a light on your amazing book. I just have to share this beautiful cover. What? Speaking of art, okay. All Boys Aren't Blue. I just love this cover so much. I loved your book so much. I had to reread it twice. I did cry. I did. I am a crier. And I wanted to know what was the biggest lesson in your story that you want to share with readers from this book?
this is from All Boys Aren't Blue.
Hmm.
The biggest lesson.
There's so many.
Yeah, because I talk about the book still, like
Mm.
I still learn a lot from it. I think the biggest lesson, though, in that book is to, I don't think I let my trauma define me. And I think in many ways, I always knew who I was.
Mhm.
And I think that's probably the biggest lesson in that book is like I always knew who I was. So it's like you know you better than anybody else knows you. And a lot of the things that we end up going through is when society gets just enough in our head to start to question self and to question whether we do know ourselves enough. And then we stop. In my case, I stopped double dutching, or I started to suppress things that were natural to me and innate to me. And that book, I think you get to see the period of joy when you're innocent in the world before the factors start to come in,
Yeah.
and you watch how hard it is once those factors start to come in and they start to dictate how you have to navigate and move in the world. And I think by the end, you start to see a person who recognizes that some of the things that they had been chasing were right there all along. And it was just about how to tap into them. And I think by the time you get to the end, that's when you start to be like, okay, like the inklings are there for George to go one way or another. Which path does George choose? And so I think that's what it is. And I think now that I'm working on the adult, I'll be working on the adult memoir soon,
Mm.
um, which would be like the sequel. I think people will see like, oh, okay, so like these little things where George's confidence was starting to build turns me into who I've become today to be able to do what I do today.
Wow. And that like horizon moment where like it does kind of come full circle and your life is still continuing. Like the story goes on.
Yeah.
Hearing that you're continuing to write, like what a joy, like what a gift. I also wanted to ask, what inspired the cover of your book? Because I kind of realized there's a similarity between both your book covers. They both are very artistic and almost linked to like a painting of sorts. I'm gonna put my mic down just to show how similar they both are. I looked at them at one point and I'm like, I'm putting these on the top because they are absolutely gorgeous. But I just had to show them and say, like, what was the similarity between the two? What draws you to this design?
Yeah. Well, part of the similarity between the two is because the same person drew them, but because it's the same artist. But
How
when it
cool.
Blue, yeah, Charlie Palmer is who designed both covers, and Charlie Palmer also does all the illustrations that are in Flamboyants. But
Mm.
when it comes to All Boys Aren't Blue, I had a vision in my mind for that cover. I was adamant that I wanted a black queer face on the cover, and it is my face that's on the cover. We just aged me down some, but yeah, I wanted like the blue fading into pink in the background. Like it's little things that people catch all the time, and then the flower crown was a choice as well that I made. The yellow rose represents my fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, which is our Founders Day today. Um,
That's
yeah, our Founders Day. I'm like, oh God, I think we're 118 today.
that's
I'm like, are
amazing.
we 118? Sounds
And
like
the
fun.
the butterflies really drew me in. They're very symbolic, and I'm like, ooh, beautiful.
Well, so the butterflies are not on the original cover.
Hmm.
The butterflies on the hardcover, there are no butterflies,
Okay.
which they may put them on there, but
Hmm.
so the poinsettia represents Nanny's. That was my grandmother Nanny's favorite flower. The bird of paradise represents my mom's favorite flower, and so that's kind of like what created the crown. The butterflies, though, one of the butterflies represents Nanny, and one represents my brother Gigi, because those are the two characters who, since I wrote All Boys Aren't Blue, passed away.
I'm so sorry.
So now they are the butterflies in the flower crown.
That is a beautiful message, though. This
I'm very
symbolism.
intentional with everything I do. If you can't
I love
tell,
that.
I
No,
made
I
that.
love the intention though, because they're with you.
Yes, they're still with me. They're just in the crown, kind of like almost like guardian angels of the flower crown.
That's beautiful.
Yep.
Wow. And I know you do in a way kind of mirror and by writing about your family, they live forever. People, I think there was a quote about that where someone said like when you fall for a writer, you're eternal. You know what I mean? Because they write about you. So you live forever. Same thing with paintings, like you live forever. So that's beautiful. And by sharing your writing, you share all your butterflies with everyone. And that's beautiful. My last question for you is, what is your dream for the future of LGBTQIA books and stories? It's a big question.
Yeah, what is my dream?
Yeah.
Uh, Ultimately, my dream is it's actually a simple one. I want more people to tell their story. Like I feel like what ends up happening is like I wrote All Boys Aren't Blue almost 5 years ago when it came out, and what ends up happening though is like, well, when do we get the next memoir in the young adult space about, because I'm a black kid who was from Jersey, but what was the black kid from the South's experience with their queer?
Mm.
What was the black kid from the Midwest memoirs experience for young adults about their queer? I want to see a canon of the experiences because they're not all the same, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like I love, that Janet Mock wrote, redefining realness, and uh, God, I'm like I said, clearly a long day because I'm just slipping on
Okay.
books, titles, and everything. My friend Raquel Willis wrote her book this year came out, on the trans experience, and so you know that's what I want to see more of, though, is
Mm.
how do we get more of the experiences in the world so that it doesn't just become like, people always name James Baldwin, but they don't name some of the other writers who existed, like the Marlon Riggs and the Joseph Beams and like or even like the Bruce Richard Nugents, like there was a whole bunch of people, right? But it's like most people would be like, oh yeah, James Baldwin was y'all's, that's y'all's, and it's like, well, yes, and also like there is a canon, right? And so I think if I had a dream, it would be for the canon to be more visible, to be
Mm.
more widely visible, so that people know that it exists. Because I just think that a lot of times people just don't know that the books exist,
There's
and
that. There's
I want
100%
more people
that.
to know. Yeah, I want more people to know that these books exist.
Mm.
Uh, you know, and so hopefully that's what'll happen, and also that we get to reclaim more of our history. Uh, because they're clearly, I'm grateful that Robert Jones wrote The Prophets because, like, clearly, yes, there was queer love in slavery. You know what I'm saying? It's like that's something that we don't talk about, but it's also something that maybe that wasn't recorded, right? Because I always say that
Mm.
history is written by the people who won. So
That's
they
true.
record it, they write what they want to write. You know what I mean? They're not going to write from the side of the oppressed. So we know it existed, right? So we're probably going to have to go into like the imaginative space and fictive space to
Mm.
write those type of stories. But that's what I want to see. I want to see the expansion of that as well.
Almost like have you ever seen like when they dig up like dinosaur bones, they gently go layer by layer. And
Yeah.
by the time they finally find the bones, they're able to almost find the story.
Yeah.
And they can't go back in time, but they are able to almost fill in the blanks.
Right.
Um, a human life is not like that, but through creativity, and honestly, I do believe that writers have to tap into something. Inspiration is not pulled from thin air. I do think that to some extent it's rooted in something, be it a dream or a family member's story, your story, maybe someone you loved, or even just a vision in your mind. Leaving room for that, and also just allow if you're ever a spiritual person, I do believe in past lives. I do believe you can meet someone I feel like you've met 1,000 times before.
Yeah.
Especially in queer relationships as well, how beautiful it is to be in a time where you can meet someone and in the privilege of being in the US. But and I am speaking from a place of privilege, but to be able to be with another person of color and walk outside, to be able to go to an art museum and enjoy the art together, to be able to have a home, to build
Yeah.
a family, to make your own little history. And you don't have to be a famous person to have that. But
Absolutely.
it's
Yeah. That's really
yeah.
what the Jimmy Daniels of the world. Like you again, that's why, like you don't have to you don't have to be a famous person to have that. And I think that's really again why I wrote the book with my grandmother in it. Because some of the best quotes that I have that I live by are from her. They're not from
Mm,
MLK or Malcolm X, they're from her. And
absolutely.
I think about her quotes. I also think about a lot of Toni Morrison quotes because I don't know, I just feel very connected to everything that she says. But I
Mm,
also talk about my grandmother's quotes publicly because those are like that the same thing. They're coming from that same spirit, that same vein. So
Absolutely. And I think as well, like coming out, Audre Lorde was the first Black lesbian who I ever heard of and I got to read about. And I was like, I tethered to her. And there's a quote in your book from Flamboyants when you said, I was desperate for someone to look up to. Black kids deserve to have heroes. I found Audre Lorde, and in my mind, I tethered to her so deeply. I didn't look for anyone, and I can admit that. Like I really didn't look for anyone else. I thought, well, I have this person, and where else am I going to find another Black lesbian poet or filmmaker or whatever? And luckily, coming from a place of privilege, I was able to find Black directors who were queer and lesbians, and find stories that, were beautiful and amazing outside of just the L word that's
yeah.
actually quite toxic towards Black women, but we'll leave that there. Um, does not depict us well at all, or the trans community well at all. But I think that's why, finding books like yours and being able to have the compassion to admit, I actually don't know that many Black queer authors. I want to find more. Reading Flamboyance, reading your memoir, being able to feel seen, is so important. And I hope that we can find more people who write those amazing books. And just like you're so brilliant. I do want to close out with one quote that I thought was so beautiful. I call them flamboyants. Their lives were full of color, wisdom, and experiences that shined brightly beyond the confines of their time. Wow. I can't express enough how your book is like dessert. It's a gift. It's sweet. It has bitter moments. You think about it all the time and you just want to go back and get more. So I hope for more of your books. Where can everyone find you?
Pretty much, I am GM Johnson. It's like iamgmjohnson.com or I am GM Johnson on Instagram, Twitter, Blue Sky, TikTok. Facebook is the only one where it's George Matthew Johnson, my
Mm,
or
okay.
George Matthew Johnson. And sometimes if you see Garcon at the end of it, it's because I am in the ballroom and that is my ballroom last name. So yes.
Yes, that's so cool. Okay, I do want to you inspired me earlier. You're like, "Can we take a picture?" I was like, "Yes, I do." So if it's okay, I would love to take a little photo to put on the social medias. So I'm gonna do that right now. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. And I just feel very grateful to have even spoken to you. Like 2024 is full of joy. I can't wait for your next book. And thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.